The air inside the regional branch of First Piedmont Bank smelled exactly like wet wool and stale carpets from the rain outside. I sat in a faux leather chair that stuck slightly to the back of my trench coat, watching my husband, Richard, adjust the knot of his silk tie with fingers that were just beginning to tremble. Across the wide oak desk, Mr. Vance, a bank manager who had held his position since the Carter administration, didn't look at Richard, he looked at me, his spectacles resting precariously on the bridge of his nose, holding a single crisp piece of legal-sized paper that had been pulled from the deepest drawer of their archiving vault. "Mrs. Miller," Mr. Vance said, his voice carrying the heavy, deliberate cadence of a small-town Georgia professional who had seen 50 years of family secrets cross his desk. "I want to be absolutely clear before we proceed. This document is the original copy of the restrictive covenant attached to your late grandfather's estate account. It was filed 3 weeks before his passing." I didn't look at Richard, but I could hear his breathing next to me, short, shallow, the sound a man makes when the floorboards beneath his feet begin to groan. He had spent the last 6 months telling anyone who would listen at the Oakwood Country Club that he had successfully managed our family's financial portfolio to secure his son's future. He had smiled at the wedding rehearsal dinner just 48 hours prior, clinking his champagne glass against his 24-year-old son Brody's glass, bragging about the 5-star catering, the oceanfront venue in Savannah, and the customized Audi parked outside with a giant red bow on the hood. He had done it all using $42,000 that had belonged to me since I was 7 years old. "Eleanor, sweetheart," Richard whispered, his voice dropping into that smooth, practiced timbre he used whenever he wanted to remind me that he was the executive vice president of a regional logistics firm and I was simply a high school English teacher. "We don't need to make a scene here. We discussed this. It's an internal family transfer. We're a unit now. Brody's wedding is an investment in our collective future." "The document in Mr. Vance's hand," I said, keeping my voice low, clear, and completely devoid of the tremor he was expecting, "says otherwise." Within 48 hours, the wire transfers Richard had authorized to the Savannah wedding vendors would be flagged by the state auditor's office. The elegant invitations sitting on 300 upper-middle-class coffee tables across the county would become useless scraps of linen cardstock, and Richard's carefully cultivated reputation as the patriarch of one of the county's most successful blended families would evaporate before the rain stopped hitting the pavement outside. But to understand how a man could sit at his own kitchen table, look his wife of 5 years in the eye, and systematically empty the account meant for her graduate tuition to pay for an ice sculpture and a 6-piece jazz band for a stepson who hadn't spoken to her in 6 months, you have to look at the dust on the floorboards of a small farmhouse 3 miles outside of the town limits. You have to understand how greed doesn't usually arrive with a shout. It arrives with the quiet rustle of a bank statement being slipped into a recycling bin while the house is asleep. The $42,000 hadn't started as a number on a digital screen. It had started as $20 bills, folded tightly and secured with thick rubber bands, kept inside an old metal Folgers coffee can on the top shelf of my grandfather's workshop. My grandfather, Arthur Vance, no relation to the bank manager, though they had gone to school together in the 50s, was a man who smelled permanently of cedar shavings, liquid wrench, and the peppermint candies he kept in his flannel shirt pockets to keep from smoking. When my mother passed away when I was 6, Arthur took me in. He didn't have much, just 40 acres of scrub oak and a small 3-bedroom home with a screened-in porch that rattled every time the Norfolk Southern freight train rolled through the valley. He was a master carpenter by trade, a man whose hands were permanently calloused and stained with dark walnut stain. Every Saturday morning, he would sit at the small Formica kitchen table with a yellow legal pad, tracking the wood he had sold to the local cabinet makers or the furniture he had repaired for the wealthy families over in the historic district. "Eleanor," he'd say to me, his voice rough like gravel but infinitely gentle, "money isn't something you spend to look big in front of your neighbors. Money is a wall. If you build it right, it keeps the cold out. It keeps people from telling you who you have to be." Every time he finished a job, whether it was rebuilding the altar at First Baptist or fixing the mahogany banisters at the old plantation house turned event venue, he would take a specific portion of that cash and put it into the Folgers can. It was my college fund, a promise he made to my mother when she was in the hospice bed at County General. He didn't trust the big modern investment firms that sent glossy brochures in the mail. He trusted the local bank where he knew the teller's mother, and he trusted his own calloused hands. When I turned 12, he took me down to First Piedmont Bank. I remember the heavy brass doors and the way the air conditioning felt like a physical slap after the July heat. He handed the teller $3,000 in small bills, the culmination of an entire winter spent building custom cedar chests. "Put it in a dedicated educational trust for the girl," he told the girl behind the counter, "and make sure it's locked down tight. No one touches this but her when the time comes." That account wasn't just tuition money for me. It was every hour my grandfather had spent working in a freezing barn with a kerosene heater that didn't quite work. It was the skin he had scraped off his knuckles when a router slipped. It was the fact that he wore the same gray winter coat for 9 years so he wouldn't have to touch the money in the can. When he died during my junior year at Georgia Southern, that account was the only thing left of him besides the smell of cedar in his old bedroom. It allowed me to get my degree in education without a dime of debt, and there was exactly $42,000 left over, money he had explicitly designated for my master's degree in literacy development if I chose to pursue it, or for a down payment on a home of my own choice. I met Richard 3 years after my grandfather passed. He was everything my grandfather wasn't. Polished, fast-talking, with a smile that looked like it had been designed by a marketing team. He was a widower with a teenage son, Brody, and at 26, still raw from losing the only parent figure I had left, I mistook his control for security. We married in a small civil ceremony, and I moved into his house in the Willow Creek subdivision, a development where every house had the same manicured lawn, the same beige stucco exterior, and the same quiet underlying pressure to keep up with the family next door. It didn't take long for the temperature in that house to drop. In my grandfather's house, everything had been old, worn, and full of space for me. In Richard's house, every room was a stage set for a family that didn't actually exist. Brody was 17 when I moved in, a boy who had been taught from infancy that his comfort was the primary objective of the household. If Brody needed a new set of golf clubs for the high school team, Richard bought them before the week was out, using the corporate credit card or shifting funds from their household account. If Brody dented the bumper of his first car, a brand new Jeep Wrangler Richard had bought him for his 16th birthday, Richard laughed it off at the dinner table, calling it a rite of passage, while asking me if I could skimp on the grocery budget for the next month to cover the insurance deductible. "We have to support his development, Eleanor," Richard would say, his voice smooth and dismissive as he patted my hand over the dinner table. "He's a young man trying to find his way in the world. You understand how important appearances are for his college applications." I noticed the small things first. When my birthday rolled around, Richard bought me a generic $15 gift card to the local coffee shop, wrapped in a plain white envelope he had taken from his office desk. But when Brody wanted to spend spring break in Cabo with his friends, Richard spent 3 nights at the kitchen table, working late on spreadsheets, finding a way to make the numbers work so his son wouldn't feel left out among his wealthy classmates from the private academy. My books, the old cloth-bound volumes of Southern literature my grandfather had bought me at estate sales, were relegated to cardboard boxes in the garage because Richard said they didn't match the minimalist aesthetic of the built-in bookshelves in the living room. Those shelves were filled instead with glossy architectural magazines and trophies Brody had won for junior varsity tennis, trophies for tournaments where he had placed 4th but received a massive gilded cup anyway because the country club believed everyone who paid the membership fee deserved a memory. I became a ghost in that house, a reliable source of secondary income that kept the machinery running. My teacher's salary went directly into our joint household checking account to cover the utility bills, the lawn service, and the premium groceries Richard insisted on having in the pantry for when his corporate colleagues stopped by for drinks. My personal savings, the $42,000 from my grandfather, remained in the separate old trust account at First Piedmont. Richard knew it was there, but for the first 3 years of our marriage, he treated it like a quaint, insignificant detail, the way a city man looks at an old tractor in a field. A little school teacher fund, he called it once during a dinner party with his boss, laughing softly as he filled everyone's wine glasses. Eleanor keeps her little inheritance tucked away for her books. It's sweet, really, gives her a sense of independence. I didn't say anything then. I just looked at my plate, remembering the calluses on my grandfather's hands. The shift began during the winter of 2025 when Brody announced his engagement to Caroline Vance, again a distant branch of the same family that populated half the town's professional sector. Caroline's family owned 3 car dealerships along the interstate. They were people who judged a person's worth by the year of their vehicle and the size of their backyard patio. Suddenly, the upcoming wedding wasn't just a family celebration, it was Richard's personal coronation. He spent hours on the phone in his home office, his voice booming through the drywall as he talked to caterers in Savannah and event coordinators at the yacht club. He wanted the best of everything: a raw bar with oysters flowing in from the coast, a customized ice sculpture of a sailboat, and a premium open bar with top-shelf bourbon that cost $80 a bottle. "We can't look like the poor relations, Eleanor," Richard told me one evening, his eyes bright with a sort of frantic energy as he flipped through a catering brochure that looked like a fashion magazine. "The Vance family is going to have half the city council there. My promotion to senior vice president is coming up in June. This wedding is where those decisions are cemented. People need to see that the Millers are a family of substance." "Richard," I said, setting my grading pen down on the kitchen island, "the budget you're looking at is over $60,000. You told me last month that your personal savings were tied up in the market downturn." "It's under control," he said quickly, his face hardening for a fraction of a second before that smooth executive mask slipped back into place. "I'm managing the liquidity. Don't worry your head about the invoices. Just focus on your lesson plans." A week later, the first sign of the true damage appeared. I was looking for a missing utility bill in the desk in our home office when I found a scrap of paper in the small wastebasket beside Richard's chair. It was a handwritten calculation sheet in Richard's precise architectural script. He had listed the expenses for the Savannah venue, the band deposit, and the down payment on the Audi he intended to give Brody as a wedding gift. At the bottom of the page, there was a single line with a question mark next to it. "Ease Piedmont account, $42K. My blood didn't run cold, it went entirely still. I sat there in the quiet office, listening to the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen, looking at that small slip of paper. He hadn't asked me, he hadn't brought it up over dinner. He had simply looked at my grandfather's sweat and bone, and he had listed it as an available asset on his personal balance sheet. That night, I checked our joint online banking portal. My separate trust account at First Piedmont wasn't visible on the main dashboard because it was held under my maiden name in grandfather's estate structure, but I noticed that Richard had requested a physical transfer authorization form from the bank's customer service department 3 days prior. He had left the printout in his leather briefcase, which he had left unzipped on the hallway bench. The memory of my grandfather's final days in that small county hospital room came back to me then with the force of a physical blow. He had been 82, his skin translucent, his breathing shallow beneath the green plastic oxygen mask. He had reached out with a hand that no longer had the strength to lift a hammer, and he had taken my wrist. "Eleanor," he'd whispered, his breath smelling faintly of the hospital gelatin they left on his tray. "The world is full of men who know how to talk without saying anything. They'll look at what you've got and they'll tell you it's theirs by right of being louder. Don't you give an inch of that ground. That money isn't for a house or a fancy coat. It's your freedom. If things go bad, you take that money and you go somewhere where nobody can tell you what your name is worth." I had promised him. I had wept into the scratchy hospital blanket, promising him that I would protect it. Now, 5 years later, I was living with a man who viewed that promise as an administrative hurdle. The next afternoon, I received a notification on my phone. It was an automated text from First Piedmont Bank alerting me that an online password reset request had been initiated for my estate account. 10 minutes later, Richard called me from his office. "Hey, honey," he said, his voice casual, almost breezy. "Hey, I was trying to update our master financial file for the mortgage renewal next month, and the system is giving me a hard time with that old Piedmont account of yours. What was the security answer for your grandfather's hometown again? I want to make sure we have everything aligned for the bank auditors." He didn't mention the wedding. He didn't mention the Savannah caterers who were demanding their second installment by Friday. He was using the language of administrative necessity to extract the key to my grandfather's vault. "I don't remember it off the top of my head, Richard," I said, looking out the classroom window at the gray school bus lot. Right, he said, his tone sharpening just enough for me to hear the irritation underneath. "Well, don't drag your feet on it. The mortgage guys are on a tight schedule, and any unverified assets look sloppy on our profile. See you around 6. He hung up without saying goodbye. On Thursday morning, while Richard was at an executive breakfast meeting across town, I went down to the main branch of First Piedmont Bank. I didn't go to the drive-thru or the regular teller line. I walked straight to the back offices, where Mr. Vance sat behind his glass wall, surrounded by framed photographs of Old Town Council members and historical maps of the county. He recognized me instantly. He stood up, shaking my hand with that old-fashioned, formal courtesy that seemed to have disappeared everywhere else in town. "Eleanor," he said, gesturing to the chair opposite him, "it's been a while. I see your name on the account ledger every month, but I don't see you in the branch often. How is the school year treating you?" "It's busy, Mr. Vance," I said, sitting down and placing my purse on my lap. "I'm actually here because I need to review the recent activity on my grandfather's estate account. I've been getting some security alerts, and I want to see the full physical statements for the last 60 days. Mr. Vance's expression shifted. The warm, neighborly smile vanished, replaced by that cautious, professional stillness that bank managers use when they know a storm is coming. He typed something into his terminal, his fingers clicking rhythmically on the old keyboard. He stared at the screen for a long, silent moment, his brow furrowing beneath his silver hair. "Eleanor," he said, his voice dropping an octave, "did you authorize a power of attorney modification on this account last month?" "No," I said, my voice steady. Mr. Vance reached into a physical folder on his desk and pulled out a 2-page document. He turned it around so I could see it. It was a standard First Piedmont third-party authorization form. It bore my name, my social security number, and a signature at the bottom that looked remarkably like mine, the same high loops on the E, the same sharp tail on the R. It had been notarized by a young woman named Brenda, who worked as a receptionist at Richard's logistics firm. "Your husband came into the branch 2 weeks ago," Mr. Vance said quietly. "He had this document, along with your original marriage certificate and a copy of the estate index. He stated that you were currently bedridden with a severe bout of flu and needed him to handle the tuition disbursement for your upcoming summer courses. Since the signature matched our digital file from 5 years ago and it carried a corporate notary stamp, the assistant manager processed the temporary administrative link." "And the balance?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Mr. Vance pulled a fresh printout from his laser printer and handed it to me. The top line showed the balance from 3 months ago, $42,118.50. The line beneath it, dated 6 days ago, showed a single, massive counter-withdrawal via cashier's check made out to the Oyster Pavilion and Yacht Club, Savannah, GA. The current balance was $118.50. He had left exactly $100 more than the minimum required to keep the account from automatically closing and triggering a notification letter to my home address. "I can freeze the account immediately, Eleanor," Mr. Vance said, his hand already hovering over his phone. "This is an unauthorized transaction. If you want to file a formal fraud affidavit, we can begin the recovery process through our legal department. But you need to understand, since he is your legal spouse and used a notarized form, this will immediately involve the county sheriff's department. Your husband's firm does a lot of business with this bank. This will not be a quiet matter. I sat there, looking at the number $118.50. I could feel the heat of my grandfather's workshop in that small printout. I could see the old Folgers can. I could see Richard standing in his silk tie, telling his boss that his family was a family of substance. "Don't freeze it yet, Mr. Vance," I said, looking up. "Is there something else in the vault? The original covenant my grandfather signed when we opened the account in 2012? I remember him telling the teller that he wanted specific terms attached to the estate release." Mr. Vance paused, his eyes slightly behind his glasses. He looked at me for a long time, as if measuring whether the girl who used to come in here in overalls with Arthur Vance was strong enough for what she was asking. "Arthur was a very particular man, Eleanor," Mr. Vance said softly. "He didn't just open a savings account. He used a testamentary educational trust vehicle. Give me 15 minutes. I need to go down to the old basement archive." When I got home that afternoon, the house was a hive of activity. Brody and Caroline were in the living room, surrounded by large cardboard boxes containing silver-plated serving trays, crystal wine glasses, and designer luggage. Richard was standing by the fireplace, a glass of scotch in his hand, his face flushed with the satisfaction of a man who had successfully staged a major production. "Eleanor!" Richard called out as I walked through the door, his voice booming with that false, expansive warmth he used when he had an audience. "Come look at this. Caroline's parents just sent over the guest list adjustments. We've got 3 state representatives coming down for the reception. I told the caterer to upgrade the seafood bar to include Maine lobster claws. We're going all out." Brody didn't look up from his phone. He was sitting on our linen sofa with his feet on the mahogany coffee table, the one my grandfather had built for me as a wedding gift, the only piece of his furniture Richard had allowed in the house, because it looked antique enough to pass for a high-end designer piece. "Hey, Eleanor," Brody said carelessly, his fingers clicking on his screen. "Dad said we're using your old truck to haul the gift boxes back from Savannah after the wedding. Make sure you clear out the back cab, all right? I don't want my garment bags getting dusty from whatever you keep in there." "The truck belongs to my grandfather's estate, Brody," I said quietly, stopping by the edge of the rug. "It's not a utility vehicle for the wedding party." Richard's smile tightened at the corners. He set his scotch glass down with a small, sharp clink on the mantelpiece. "Eleanor, let's not be difficult in front of the kids," he said, his voice dropping into that calm, parental tone he used to minimize my presence. "We're all family here. We're all contributing what we can to make this a memorable weekend for Brody. It's a group effort." "A group effort," I repeated, looking at him. "Is that what we're calling it now, Richard?" "Of course," he said, walking over and placing a heavy, possessive hand on my shoulder. His fingers dug in just enough to let me know he wanted me to stay quiet. "In fact, I need you to sign a quick authorization release for the Piedmont documentation tonight. The bank manager called my office earlier saying there was an administrative discrepancy with the estate account. I told him you'd bring the corrected signature down before the rehearsal dinner tomorrow." He was lying to me to his face, smoothly, effortlessly, while his stepson sat 3 feet away planning out his honeymoon in Maui. He believed I was too timid, too broken by the loss of my family, and too concerned with maintaining the peace in our marriage to ever look beneath the surface of his files. He thought a high school English teacher from the country didn't have the stomach for a public reckoning. "I'll take care of it tomorrow morning, Richard," I said, stepping out from under his hand, "directly with Mr. Vance." "Good girl," he said, turning back to his son without another thought. "Now, Brody, let's look at the seating charts for the head table. We need to make sure the dealership executives are seated next to the logistics team." That night, I didn't sleep in our bedroom. I stayed up in the small guest room at the back of the house, the one that looked out over the woods behind the subdivision. I sat at the small desk with the single piece of paper Mr. Vance had retrieved from the basement vault of First Piedmont Bank. The document wasn't a standard bank form. It was a restrictive testamentary covenant drafted by my grandfather's old attorney, Mr. Abernathy, before he retired to Florida. It stated in absolute ironclad legal prose that the funds in account 4412 were non-transferable to any third party, including spouses, legal guardians, or executors, under any circumstances prior to the beneficiary's 35th birthday, unless the funds were paid directly via institutional check to an accredited graduate school registrar. Furthermore, the covenant contained a specific clause, Clause 7A, which my grandfather had insisted upon after seeing his own sister lose her farm to a predatory land speculator in the 70s. It stated that any unauthorized attempt to withdraw or clear funds from the trust via third-party documentation would automatically trigger an immediate clawback provision, rendering the authorizing signature null and void and placing a temporary indefinite lien on any secondary accounts held by the individual who presented the fraudulent authorization, up to the full value of the attempted withdrawal. Richard hadn't just stolen $42,000 from me. He had linked our joint household account, the one where his corporate salary was deposited, to the Piedmont portal to facilitate the wire transfer. He had unknowingly signed a document that allowed First Piedmont Bank to freeze his own primary checking and investment accounts the moment the fraud affidavit was processed. He had walked into a trap that had been laid 14 years ago by an old man who wore flannel shirts and didn't trust city men with smooth smiles. I looked out the window at the rain starting to fall over the pines. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel broken. I felt a deep, quiet reverence for the old man who had sat at that formica table with his yellow pad, looking forward into a future he wouldn't live to see, building a wall high enough to keep his granddaughter safe. The confrontation didn't happen at the yacht club in Savannah, and it didn't happen with a screaming match in our kitchen. It happened exactly where the betrayal had been executed, in the quiet, carpeted office of Mr. Vance at First Piedmont Bank at 9 o'clock on Friday morning, 5 hours before the rehearsal dinner was scheduled to begin. Richard had arrived angry, his coat wet from the downpour, his phone buzzing incessantly in his pocket. He had been forced to leave his office during a senior management meeting because Mr. Vance had informed his secretary that an administrative hold had been placed on the Miller family's corporate line of credit. "What is the meaning of this, Vance?" Richard demanded as he slammed his leather briefcase onto the oak desk. "We have 24 checks out to vendors in Savannah right now. My son's wedding is tonight. I don't have time for small-town bookkeeping errors. My wife is here to sign the clearance form, so let's get this sorted out immediately." Mr. Vance didn't flinch. He adjusted his glasses, looked at Richard for 3 seconds, and then reached into his desk drawer. He didn't pull out the clearance form. He pulled out 2 separate documents, the original 2012 testamentary covenant and a certified copy of the fraud affidavit I had signed 20 minutes prior in the presence of a bank notary. "Mr. Miller," Mr. Vance said, his voice completely level, carrying the weight of an institution that had outlasted 3 local gold rushes and 2 depressions. "This is not a bookkeeping error. This is a criminal matter. Your wife has filed a formal affidavit stating that the third-party authorization form you presented on April 14th carries a forged signature." Richard laughed, a quick barking sound that lacked any real mirth. He turned to me, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and sudden, sharp venom. "Eleanor, what nonsense have you been telling these people?" he said, his voice dropping into that falsely calm, manipulative tone he used whenever he wanted to make me feel small. You're confused. We talked about this. You agreed to let us use the educational surplus for Brody's event. You're making an absolute fool of yourself in front of my business associates." "I never agreed, Richard," I said. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't lean forward. I sat back in my chair, my hands folded over my purse. "I never saw the form. You had your receptionist, Brenda, notarize a signature I never wrote. You took $42,000 of my grandfather's money to buy an Audi and a raw bar for a boy who hasn't called me by my name since I moved into your house." "It's family money," Richard shouted, his executive veneer cracking completely. He leaned over the desk, his face turning a dark blotchy red. "We are married, Eleanor. What's yours is mine. That money was sitting there doing nothing while my son needed a start in life. You're sabotaging his future out of pure petty spite." "Actually, Mr. Miller," Mr. Vance interrupted, tapping the original covenant with a gold-plated pen, "this is not family money. Under the terms of Arthur Vance's trust design, these funds never entered the marital estate. They are protected by a restrictive covenant that carries a strict clawback provision. Because you used a fraudulent document to extract a cashier's check from this institution, First Piedmont has already executed Clause 7A. Richard stopped. He looked from Mr. Vance to the paper on the desk. "What are you talking about? What clause?" "As of 8:30 this morning," Mr. Vance said, reading from his screen with a distinct lack of emotion, "your joint household checking account, your personal savings account, and the secondary line of credit you used to secure the catering contract in Savannah have been frozen to satisfy the lien. The $42,000 has been restored to Eleanor's trust from your personal assets. The remaining balances in your accounts are currently unavailable, pending the outcome of the Sheriff's Department investigation into the fraudulent notary fraud." Richard's phone buzzed on the desk. The screen lit up with the name Caterer, Savannah. Then it buzzed again, Brody. Then a third time, Executive Committee, Main Office. He reached for the phone with a hand that was visibly shaking. He tried to swipe the screen, but his fingers were too slick with sweat. He looked at me, and for the first time in 5 years, I didn't see the executive vice president. I didn't see the man who ran the Willow Creek Homeowners Association, or the patriarch who gave speeches at the country club. I saw a small, panicked man who had built his entire life out of borrowed cards, realization hitting him that the deck had just collapsed. "Eleanor," he whispered, his voice cracking as he reached across the space between our chairs. "Eleanor, please, you can't do this. The wedding is in 5 hours. The checks are going to bounce. Caroline's father, he's on the board of directors at my firm. If he finds out about this, I'm done. My career is over. We can fix this at home, please." "My grandfather wore the same coat for 9 years, Richard," I told him, looking him directly in the eyes. "He didn't do it so your son could drive an Audi. He did it so I'd never have to listen to a man like you tell me what I'm worth." I stood up, pulling my trench coat around my shoulders. I didn't wait for him to open his briefcase, and I didn't wait to see if he answered the phone that was still vibrating against the oak desk. The wedding in Savannah didn't happen the way Richard had planned. The catering staff refused to set up the lobster bar after their bank notified them that the wire transfer had been recalled, and the jazz band never left their van in the parking lot. The event was reduced to a tense, hurried ceremony in the backyard of Caroline's parents' house, with cold fried chicken from the local grocery deli, and a crowd of guests who spent the afternoon whispering about why the Miller family's accounts had been locked down by the county court. Richard didn't get his promotion in June. In fact, he was asked to resign from the logistics firm 3 weeks after the bank branch meeting, after the state notary board stripped his receptionist's license and the sheriff's department filed an official report regarding the fraudulent authorization form. He lives in a small 2-bedroom apartment near the interstate now, his Willow Creek house sold during the divorce proceedings to cover the legal fees and the outstanding debts from his son's wedding. I didn't stay in the county to watch the fallout. 3 days after that rainy morning at the bank, I packed my boxes from the garage, the ones filled with my old cloth-bound Southern literature books, and loaded them into the back of my grandfather's old Chevrolet truck. I used the $42,000 to pay for my first semester of graduate housing at the University of Virginia, where I'm currently completing my master's degree in reading education. It's a quiet campus, full of old brick buildings and large oak trees that look a lot like the ones that grew around my grandfather's barn. Sometimes when I'm sitting in the library late at night with a stack of research papers in front of me, I'll run my fingers over the edges of the old mahogany box my grandfather built for me. It still smells faintly of cedar shavings and liquid wrench, even after all these years. And I realize then that the money wasn't the wall he was building for me. The wall was the knowledge that someone had loved me enough to plan ahead for my freedom, leaving behind a piece of truth that no amount of noise or greed could ever take away.